prison. It was much different for two reasons. One of the reasons being that my reputation preceded me and everybody knew who and what I was before I even arrived at this prison. The other reason being something called the American Civil Liberties Union. They've gone into most of our prisons and turns them into college campuses. If you could see some of the prisons that I go into on a weekly basis, you'll see that they have more luxuries in there than the majority of us have out here. And it's no wonder 8 out of 10 people return to prison when they have it so good in here compared to what we have out here. And I had a 2-year sentence because of my criminal record. They wouldn't even allow me any parole. I had to max out the whole 2 years. I had about 4 months left to go, and one day the Catholic chaplain came up to me and he said, "I've been watching you and you're a lot different than the rest of the men in this prison." And very arrogantly I said, "Of course I am. Don't you know my position in the Gambino family?" And he said, "No," he said, "I've been a prison chaplain for a long time." He said, "I've seen a lot of people in organized crime." He said, "But I see something in you I've never seen in any of them." And he said, "I understand you're going home in a few months." He said, "Do you have any plans?" And I looked at him and I laughed. I said, "Do I have any plans? I'm controlling over 40 businesses. I'm making a few $1,000,000 a year." I said, "What do you think I'm going to do when I get out?" I said, "It's back to business as usual." I said, "Why are you asking me this?" And he looked at me very seriously. And he said, "Tom, have you ever considered becoming a priest?" And I looked at him and I said, "You must be drinking too much of that communion wine. You must be drunk." I said, "You know who and what I am." And I said, "I can't be anything else." And for the next 4 months, every time I saw him, I walked in the opposite direction. Because that's the very last thing I remember my mother saying to me, that she was going to pray for me to become a priest and would not stop praying until God answered that prayer. And here was a prison chaplain that didn't even know my mother, whether she was dead or alive, and more or less telling me the same thing, and I didn't want to hear that. 4 months went by, I was released, and finally I got back home, and I got with my boss, Paul Castellano. He looked at me and he said, "Tom, what's wrong? I see a look on your face that I've never seen before." And I said, "Paul, that's the problem. I don't know what's wrong." I said, "Look at all the power that I have. Look at all the material things I have. Look at all the money I have." I said, "Paul, even with all these things, there's something missing in my life. And the problem is I have no idea what it is." And he looked at me and he laughed. He said, "Tom, look at the lives that we lead." He said, "Our phones are tapped, our houses are bugged, and every time we drive someplace, there's police surveillance following us all over the place." He said, "Tom, we don't have any freedom, and you just got out of jail. What do you expect?" He said, "Take some time off, work it out of your system. You'll be okay." I took his advice. I traveled to California for a while, Arizona, Miami. And everywhere I went, the food, the climate, the people were different, but that void in my life wasn't different, and whatever it was growing. Finally, I just returned back to New York, and I got heavily involved in all the construction and labor unions. I received a phone call from a friend of mine in Florida, and he told me he had a friend in Atlanta, Georgia, that wanted to open up a restaurant in Atlantic City, New Jersey. All the construction was going on with all the new hotels and casinos. And he asked me if I can find a favor or do a favor for him where he can get in with the least amount of money. I told him that I'd have to speak with this man from Atlanta, Georgia. I never did business over the telephone. And I told him, tell this guy from Atlanta to come to Brooklyn, New York, and I'd sit down and I'd speak with him. When this man came, when the appointment was made, right away I noticed he was wearing a diamond pinky ring, a Rolex watch with diamonds, had tailor-made clothing, alligator shoes, so him and I had a lot in common. And he was telling me about these restaurants they had in Atlanta, Georgia, and how prosperous they were and how many millions of dollars they were bringing in a year. And I found that very difficult to believe. Even though I had money and did some traveling, I never had any occasion to go to the South. And the only thing I had ever known about the South is what I saw from a television program called Hee Haw. And I couldn't imagine these big, fancy, prosperous restaurants in the middle of cornfields or cow pastures. So I told him I'd have to go to Atlanta with him and check it out for myself. We'd made the arrangements. We were flying into Atlanta. The plane started landing. I looked out the window, and instead of seeing cornfields or cow pastures, I saw the skyline of Atlanta with these great big office buildings, and I was very impressed. But I was even more impressed with this man's restaurant. He took me to the 4 that he had in operation, and we sat down, and I said, what is your ultimate goal for this business? He said, I have 4 in operations now. I want to maybe open 2 more, build myself a log cabin in the Colorado mountains, and retire. But I saw greater potential than he did. I realized if I could start franchising these restaurants or opening up 10 or 12 of them, I could eventually sell them to some mega corporations for millions and millions of dollars. But I didn't share that with him because that was my plan, and if I could see in doing it, I didn't plan on giving him anything at all. I was going to take all his restaurants and his money away from him. And I told him he wouldn't have to pay us any money at all. He can go ahead and open up his restaurant in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And all we wanted in return was a percentage of the business he now had in Atlanta. We shook hands and agreed. About 2.5 months later, his was one of the very first restaurants opened in Atlantic City, right on the Steel Pier. A few months later, we started getting our percentage. We never had Uncle Sam as our business partner. So once a month, he put one of his employees on the plane and bring us the cash. This went on for 7 or 8 months, and I received a phone call from the man from Florida who originally called me. And he said, Tom, he said, have you heard what happened to our friend in Atlanta? I didn't think anything happened. The money was coming up every month, and that's all I was really concerned about. But he told me that some drug dealers had kidnapped him, and they wanted $1 million, or they're going to kill him. And he said, Tom, I grew up with this kid. He said, we went to school together and everything. He said, I'd hate to see anything happen to him. Tom, is there any way that you can help? And when he asked me that, I hesitated. And I hesitated because of a reason. The reason I hesitated, I remembered at 17 years old, Carlo Gambino telling me about all the different things they controlled in New York and all the things they were involved in. And one of the things they weren't involved in was drugs. And he told me if I ever got involved in drugs, there'd be no explanation, no second chance, I would be killed. And I knew how serious he was because 2 of my friends attempted to get involved in one drug deal and both of them were killed. But I was a very greedy man. And I knew if I didn't do anything at all to help this guy and they killed him, I'd be out this money each month. Plus, never being around drugs, I couldn't put the connection between a restaurant owner and drug dealers, so I agreed to help. With the connections I had, it was just a matter of days before I found out the entire story about the kidnapping. This man was originally from Detroit, Michigan, and moved to Miami and then worked his way up to Atlanta. Somebody involved in the mafia in Miami and in Detroit got together and put the kidnapping scheme together. These 2 men were contacted and told to meet me at one of the airport hotels in Atlanta. When I met with them, I asked them about the kidnapping, and they started bragging about it, saying this guy wasn't connected with anybody and he was making millions of dollars a year, and they just went right in his house and snatched him, and they had him locked up in some warehouse. And they told me they already got $300,000 from him, and as soon as they got the balance of the $1 million, they were going to kill him anyway. Then I informed these men that this man that they had kidnapped was one of our business associates, and we wanted him freed immediately. And I told them that they couldn't keep the $300,000, they'd have to return it, but not return it to the restaurant owner, return it to us for the inconvenience they caused us to putting all these meetings together. And I told them by the time I got back to New York, I wanted a phone call from the restaurant owner letting me know that he was set free and he was safe. By the time I arrived back in New York, I received a phone call. The man was set free. He was safe. And he called me on the phone. He said, Tom, he said, I want to thank you for getting me set free, but he said, I owe you more than a thank you. He said, those men were planning on killing me, even if I paid them the balance of the $1 million. He said, Tom, I don't know if you realize it, but you actually saved my life. And he said, I don't know how I could ever repay you for that. And I said, don't worry about it. I do. Let's increase the percentage in your business that we have right now. By this time, we were making more money a month from his restaurant than he was. A few weeks went by, and we were told that the kidnappers were shot and killed. I guess the people that had to return the $300,000 didn't like what went down and had the kidnappers killed. But one man escaped, and the restaurant owner called me a few weeks later, and he told me that one of the kidnappers were back in Atlanta, and he was worried about that this man was going to kill him. And he said, Tom, is there any way you can help me? Can you send somebody down to look after me? And he said, I'll pay them anything, whatever you want. And I thought about it. I still had this void in my life, and I thought maybe I was just burned out in New York, that everybody had known who I was and what I was, and maybe I just needed to get away from New York for a little bit longer.